The air inside the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax. I stood in the center of the room, trying to imagine my future life, but the silence was suddenly shattered. My mother, Beatrice, lunged forward and ripped the microphone right out of the wedding coordinator's hand. The screech of feedback echoed off the high ceilings, making everyone wince. Without a hint of embarrassment, she cleared her throat and looked around the room like a queen addressing her subjects. Since I am the one paying for this entire production, I will be the one making the final decisions from here on out, she announced. Her voice was cold and left no room for debate. I looked over at my fiancé Julian, hoping he would say something, but he just stared at his shoes. His parents looked away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere with the woman holding the checkbook. Beatrice turned to me then, a tight, artificial smile plastered on her face. She reached out and patted my cheek as if I were a child. "Sweetheart, don't look so pouty. You will thank me when you look back at the photos and see a wedding that actually looks like it belongs to our family." I spent the rest of that afternoon in a state of shock, but the real blow landed that evening when I confronted Beatrice in her study. I told her that she couldn't just take over my wedding, but she didn't even look up from her ledger. That was when I found out exactly why she felt so bold. She hadn't just helped with a few deposits here and there. She had surreptitiously paid for every single vendor in full. The venue, the high-end catering, the photographer I didn't even like, every single contract was signed in her name alone. She had created a financial fortress around my special day. "If you fight me on any of this, Elena," she said calmly, finally looking up with icy blue eyes, "you will simply have no wedding at all. I will cancel every contract with a single phone call." I turned to Julian, desperate for support, but he just shrugged his shoulders. "She means well, Elena," he whispered, avoiding my gaze. "She's putting a lot of money into this. Just let her have this one thing so we can have a peaceful day." I realized then that I wasn't planning a wedding. I was the lead actress in my mother's redemption fantasy. A few days later, I showed up at what I thought was my dress fitting, only to find we weren't going to the boutique I had chosen. Beatrice had rescheduled everything behind my back. When we walked into the new shop, I felt a heavy knot form in my stomach. Waiting on a mannequin in the center of the room was a gown that looked like a ghost from the past. It was an exact replica of the dress Beatrice had worn 30 years ago. It had a high, suffocating neckline, massive puffy sleeves that looked like clouds, and delicate lace gloves. It was everything I hated. When I flatly refused to even try it on, Beatrice didn't pull me aside to talk. Instead, she raised her voice so the other customers and the strangers working there could hear her perfectly. "You have always been such an ungrateful daughter," she lamented, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually crying. Then she dropped the real bomb. She had already paid for the dress in full. It was custom, non-refundable, and already altered to her specifications. That night, Julian told me, "It's actually kind of classic, Elena. It would make her so happy." I started wondering who I was actually marrying. The following week, I demanded to see the finalized guest list, suspecting more interference. My suspicions were confirmed the moment I saw the spreadsheet. Beatrice had added 47 people I barely knew. There were co-workers from her firm, distant cousins I hadn't seen since I was a toddler, and various church acquaintances she wanted to impress. Even worse, I noticed a prominent name was missing. She had removed my college roommate and best friend Chloe, because, as Beatrice put it, we don't need that type of person at a prestigious family event. When I confronted her about the blatant disrespect, she didn't even blink. "Well, if you were the one paying the $300 per plate, you could decide who sits where," she snapped. I turned to Julian, hoping he would defend my friend, but he quietly admitted the truth. "She's also inviting several of her business investors, Elena. It's a networking opportunity for the family." Networking. At my wedding. At that moment, the scale of the betrayal finally clicked for me. This wasn't about celebrating love or the union of two families. It was about Beatrice's public image and corporate standing. The true depth of the situation became clear on a Tuesday evening when I arrived at Julian's apartment earlier than expected. I heard his voice coming from the kitchen, and I paused when I realized he was on the phone with my mother. "Don't worry, Beatrice," he said into the receiver, his tone far more intimate and subservient than I liked. "She will calm down eventually. She always does after a few days of complaining." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Always does. I walked into the kitchen and demanded to know how long they had been coordinating behind my back. Julian looked startled but didn't deny it. He admitted that this wasn't a new dynamic. "She's just a very strong-willed woman, Elena," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "It's honestly just easier to let her win these small battles so we can move on with our lives." Easier for who? I wondered. I looked him dead in the eye and asked one simple, terrifying question. "If she told you to call off this wedding because I was being too difficult, would you do it?" He hesitated for 3 long seconds. That hesitation shattered the last of my illusions. By Saturday, I thought things couldn't get any worse, but I was wrong. I arrived at the bakery for our cake tasting, only to be met by a very nervous wedding coordinator. She pulled me into a private corner and whispered, "There has been a significant change. Your ceremony location has been updated in the master file." Updated was an understatement. Beatrice had moved the entire wedding to her exclusive country club, the same place where she hosted her annual charity galas and corporate mixers. She hadn't even bothered to tell me. When I called her, she sounded bored. "The barn you picked was far too rustic and frankly, a bit dirty. The club is much more appropriate for our family's status." Our family. Never me. I hung up the phone without saying another word. I looked at the coordinator, who was clearly caught in the middle of a war she didn't want to fight. I didn't cry. Instead, I leaned in and asked a question she clearly didn't expect from a bride in my position. "I need to see the original contracts. What is the actual cancellation and transfer policy for these vendors?" I spent the next 48 hours locked in my home office, reviewing every digital contract and email thread I could find. I was looking for a loophole, a single point of leverage in the financial prison Beatrice had built. And then, buried in the fine print of the venue and catering agreements, I found it. My mother had paid the bills, but because I was the one who had initiated the initial inquiries, I was legally listed as the primary marrying party. The contract stated that while the payer held the right to cancel, the marrying party held the sole right to initiate date transfers or location changes within the same parent company. It was a tiny crack in her armor, but it was all I needed. She had been so arrogant that she hadn't bothered to have the contracts rewritten to name her as the sole authority. She simply assumed that because she held the money, she held the power. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. I didn't tell Beatrice. I didn't tell Julian. I began to build my own secret plan, working deep into the night while the world slept. The following Sunday, Beatrice hosted a large family dinner to celebrate the progress of the wedding. She stood up at the head of the table, clinking her crystal glass to get everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "To my daughter Elena, who would be completely lost and likely getting married in a drafty old shed if it weren't for my guidance." The table erupted in laughter, led by Julian and his parents. I sat there with a fixed smile on my face, feeling the weight of their mockery. Beatrice wasn't finished. And thank goodness she finally found a man like Julian, who truly understands how things work in this family and knows the value of tradition. I looked at Julian, expecting to see even a hint of embarrassment or solidarity on his face. Instead, he looked perfectly comfortable. He looked like a man who had already accepted his place as a pawn in Beatrice's game. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting one controlling woman. I was fighting an entire system of people who valued money and status over my happiness. 2 days later, Beatrice invited me to a friendly coffee at her favorite bistro. The moment I sat down, she slid a thick, professional-looking folder across the marble table. It was a prenuptial agreement, drafted by her personal team of lawyers without my knowledge. As I flipped through the pages, my hands began to shake. It didn't just protect family assets, it was a total surrender of my autonomy. One clause stated that any wedding gifts above a certain value would be considered family property, under Beatrice's trust. Another section gave her consultatory rights over our future housing and even our children's education. When I met Julian later that evening and showed him the document, I expected him to be outraged. "It's just practical, Elena," he said, barely looking at the papers. "Your mother wants to make sure the family legacy is secure. It doesn't really change anything between us." That was the moment I stopped crying. I realized that if I signed that paper, I would be selling my soul to a woman who didn't love me, to be with a man who didn't respect me. I walked out of the room and started my counterattack. I spent the next week acting like the perfect, submissive daughter. While Beatrice was busy bragging to her investors, I was on the phone with every single vendor. Using my status as the primary marrying party, I moved the wedding date forward by 2 weeks. I downsized the guest list back to my original 60 people, including Chloe. I moved the venue back to the beautiful, rustic barn I had loved from the beginning. Because I couldn't use Beatrice's money for the new deposits, I emptied my entire personal savings account to cover the change of service fees. I opened my own private payment accounts and secured new contracts that were strictly in my name. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't start a fight. I just quietly corrected the trajectory of my life. Once every piece was in place and the new invitations were sent out digitally to my real friends, I sat down at my laptop. I composed a single email to my mother. The subject line simply read, "Update regarding the upcoming event." I felt a strange sense of peace as I hit the send button. The explosion happened exactly 20 minutes after I sent the email. I heard Beatrice's car screech into my driveway, and seconds later, she was storming into my apartment without knocking. She was purple with rage, waving her phone in the air. "How dare you sabotage this wedding?" she screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "I have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into this event. I have invited people who matter." I remained sitting on my sofa, calmly sipping a cup of tea. "You didn't invest in a wedding, Mother," I said quietly. "You invested in a corporate gala. I simply moved my wedding back to where it belongs." She threatened to cancel everything, to pull the funding, to leave me with nothing. I just smiled at her. "You can't cancel it, because it's already been moved and the new deposits are paid by me. Your contracts are now for an event with no bride and no groom." That was when I looked her in the eyes and said the words I should have said years ago. "If you try to override me or contact my vendors again, you won't just lose control. You won't be invited at all." She laughed in my face, convinced that I was bluffing. "You wouldn't dream of getting married without my presence," she sneered before storming out. But the real test came an hour later when Julian arrived. He didn't come to comfort me. He came to scold me. "You have completely embarrassed my mother and Beatrice," he shouted. "Do you have any idea how this looks? You need to call the vendors right now, apologize, and put everything back the way it was." I looked at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't a partner. He was an assistant to my mother's whims. I asked him one final, simple question. "Are you marrying me because you love me, or are you just protecting the lifestyle my mother provides for you?" He didn't answer. He just looked at me with a mixture of pity and anger, as if I were the one being unreasonable. That silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was my final answer. I realized that the man I thought I loved didn't actually exist. He was just another part of the system I had to escape. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life, but it felt like a weight being lifted off my chest. I sent 2 short, final messages. The first was to Beatrice, informing her that her invitation was officially revoked and that security at the barn would be briefed to keep her out. The second was to Julian, telling him that the engagement was over and he was no longer part of the wedding or my life. For a few hours, I sat in the dark, terrified. I wondered if I had just ruined everything and if I would end up alone and humiliated. My phone began to buzz incessantly with hateful messages from Beatrice's side of the family. I was about to turn it off when a new message popped up. It was from Chloe, my college roommate. "I just got the new invite and your voicemail," she wrote. "I'm already booking my flight. Do you need help with the new planning details? I'm all in." Suddenly, the room didn't feel so dark anymore. I realized that by cutting out the people who controlled me, I had made room for the people who actually loved me. Months later, the sun set over the original barn, casting a warm golden glow over the wooden beams and the simple wildflower arrangements. It was a small, intimate gathering with only 60 people who had supported me through the hardest year of my life. There were no corporate investors, no high-neck lace gowns, and no grand, controlling speeches. The wedding was real, and it was beautiful, but there was one major twist that no one saw coming, least of all Beatrice. I was indeed getting married, but not to Julian. I was standing at the altar with Marcus, the lead carpenter who had helped me restore the barn months ago. He had watched the entire drama unfold from the sidelines, offering me quiet support and a place to vent when I felt like I was losing my mind. He was the one who had said, "You deserve to be chosen first, Elena, not used as a prop." We didn't need a 3-tier cake or a country club ballroom to feel the weight of our vows. We had joy, we had our true friends, and most importantly, we had peace. A year has passed since that day, and I recently ran into Julian at a local coffee shop. He looked tired, his clothes slightly wrinkled, and the arrogance was gone from his eyes. He admitted that his life had spiraled after I left. Without my cooperation, Beatrice had turned her controlling nature entirely on him and his family. The original big wedding had been called off at the last minute because Beatrice had tried to change the groom's suit to match her father's, and Julian's family had finally reached their breaking point. The investors had pulled back, and the family tension had exploded into a series of public lawsuits. Control, it turns out, has very expensive consequences. Meanwhile, Marcus and I are building a life that is entirely our own. The greatest revenge wasn't humiliating my mother or making a scene. It was simply refusing to be owned by her anymore. The last thing I ever said to her still echoes in my mind whenever I feel the urge to please others. You can host your own event, mother. But you no longer get to run my life.